Our journey by train from Montreal to Edmonton was uneventful but relaxing, and provided leisure time for Claire and I to anticipate what lay ahead, and once more browse through the plans which had been made during the winter months for our trip. Preferring the 4-hour jet flight rather than the 2-day train trip, Lorne and Lucille Bouchard had decided to fly and would join us in Edmonton. Before continuing, I think it would be a good thing to pause for a few seconds and look at the map, which gives a good idea of the route we followed, and which, when completed, would cover some 8,000 miles. Our departure point was the gateway to the north, Edmonton, from which we flew to Hay River, boarded our boat, and proceeded down the great river to the Arctic Ocean and Tuktoyaktuk, which can be seen right at the top of the map. Various outposts, rivers, and other points of interest will be referred to during the film. Our anxiety to get underway is evidenced by the sunrise in Edmonton, which was taken the morning of our departure. Upon our arrival at the airport, we met Lorne and Lucille, and all of us were somewhat dismayed at the size of the plane, which would carry us and our baggage 600 miles north to Hay River. However, all was well, and before long we were underway. Alexandra Falls provided quite a spectacle from our plane before coming in over Hay River and our eventual landing at the so-called airport. This is our first glimpse of the Liard River, an old river tug 60 feet long and built in 1923. She would be our home for the next 3 weeks. Before departing, Claire and Lucille add a little touch of home. The waterfront at Hay River is typical of all northern shipping centers. It is also the operational headquarters of the Yellowknife Transportation Company, whose president, Earl Harcourt, very kindly came down to wish us a bon voyage. The long-awaited moment arrived, and we departed, soon to find ourselves on that tremendous expanse of water, Great Slave Lake. Fortunately, the weather was clear and warm, as we had heard that a storm here can rival many of the world's largest oceans in ferocity. We were on the lake approximately 4.5 hours, during which time we inspected our little boat, unpacked our baggage, relaxed and refreshed ourselves. The Yellowknife Transportation Company tug YT Marjorie very kindly lent us an extra bilge pump, which fortunately we never made use of. Claire looking very busy acquiring her sea legs, and Lucille in a pensive mood. Claire did not take long to apply her artistic talents to some riverbed clay brought up by our anchor. The headwaters of the Mackenzie flow out of the lake cold and clean at about 5 knots an hour and are the beginning of 1,200 miles of wilderness, interrupted only by little posts such as Fort Providence in the distance, and which lie 100 to 150 miles apart on this great river, discovered by Sir Alexander Mackenzie in 1789, the second largest in the Western Hemisphere. Lorne didn't waste any time in getting down to work. The river dredges are constantly striving to keep the channel clear of the shifting sandbars and the silt brought down by the many rivers which empty into the Mackenzie. One of our first stops was Browning's Landing, which we learned had just been vacated by Mr. Browning. We were told that he is a Mormon, has at least 4 wives and 60-odd grandchildren and children to his credit. Among other things, he operates a sawmill, as can be seen here by the great mounds of sawdust on the beach. The scenery in this section of the river is not spectacular, but already we were conscious of the tremendous expanse of the river and the country through which it flows. The swiftness of the water is present all the way to the delta and flows at a rate seldom less than 3 knots per hour. The river here is characterized by high stone and clay banks, which through the centuries have been scarred by the great breakup of the ice every spring. Located near Fort Simpson is École Jean Marie, a trade school to teach Indian children various crafts. Our very talented chef, Bobby, and Claire looking at Fort Simpson in the distance, which was to be our first refueling stop. Some Indian boys eager to pose for the camera, and a family complete with Samoyed pups departing for the lower reaches of the river. A frantic call for help brought the government boat Ekaloo to our position 15 miles below Fort Simpson, where we were beached with a broken fuel pump. She soon departed in an attempt to find replacements at Fort Simpson. Claire and Lucille inspecting some of the many unusual stones which we found on the beaches. The next morning, the Ekaloo was back, after having sent a message to Hay River to send the necessary parts. It is interesting that Ekaloo is Slavey Indian for marker of trails, which aptly describes her activities in looking after the river markers. At any time during our voyage when we were delayed for one reason or another, it always provided the opportunity of meeting new and delightful people. Captain Nelson paid us a visit from the Ekaloo, and also retired Captain Naylor, who had many fascinating stories to tell about his life on the Mackenzie. He is a cousin of Canon Naylor, rector of Trinity Memorial Church in Montreal. Lorne was quick to seize this opportunity of painting his first large canvas of the Liard River and the Ekaloo. Shortly after, with the arrival by plane of a mechanic, we were underway once more. This is the beginning of the true mountain country of the Mackenzie River, which for the next 500 miles is flanked on the west by the Mackenzie Mountains and on the east by the Franklin Mountains. We passed Lone Mountain, which is part of the Mackenzie Range, the largest group of mountains in the Western Hemisphere. And Lorne sketched in his usual prolific manner. Some rather unusual cloud formations, and a rainstorm in the distance, which fortunately we missed. Our first real contact with the Slavey Indians of this part of the river at this encampment very close to Willow Lake River. The Indians build food caches on stilts for protection against bears and wolves. These and other permanent dwellings are held together by hardened clay from the river bottom. This is John Tetzel of the Slavey tribe and his family. The ever-present dogs, which no Indian family seems to be without. They are a mixture of northern breeds and are chained all summer and only work during the trapping season in the winter. John Tetzo at one time had been the chief, but had given up his role in order to spend more time with his family and to write a column in the mission paper in Fort Simpson, where he and his family lived during the winter. After Lauren did some sketching, we took the whole family, plus grandfather, to show them the Liard River. Following their visit, the children were delighted with Claire's drawing pad and crayons. A frequent happening on the river is the early morning fog, which in the warmth of the sun disappears quickly, but can be menacing to river traffic. Fort Wrigley, and the mountain that soaks its feet in the water, aptly named by the Indians. It is rather amazing how the trees, even in this northern climate, have pushed through solid rock in order to survive. Our skipper, Al Fluho, and Bobby attending to his washing chores. In order to discover the course of this great river, which he hoped would lead him to the Pacific Ocean, Mackenzie climbed the Franklin Mountains, which can be seen in the distance. This scene we were to experience for many nights, with Lauren sketching, followed by a bonfire on the beach. Along this section of the river are what is known as the everlasting fires. Actually, they are lignite beds which have been burning for centuries and were recorded by Mackenzie during his voyage in 1789. The red areas along the beach are where they are located, and at night can be seen glowing red in the darkness. Fort Norman is located at the mouth of Great Bear River, a turbulent stretch of water which drains Great Bear Lake 60 miles to the west, a tremendous inland sea renowned for its fishing, and actually only ice-free for 6 weeks of the year. Great Bear Mountain seems to stand as a lonely sentinel to the entrance of the river. The river was an incredible blue, and we took the opportunity of filling our water tanks. Claire also took the opportunity of trying out a new hairdo. The Mackenzie by this time has become brown as a result of the many rivers which empty into it from the west. Most of these rivers have had a long and arduous journey through rugged wilderness from the Rocky Mountains, and have brought with them a great amount of silt and other deposits which quickly discolor the blue Mackenzie. Our next stop was Norman Wells, at which is located the most northerly oil refinery in the world, operated by Imperial Oil Limited. A very ambitious plan was to have oil pumped from here by pipeline built through hundreds of miles of wilderness to the west and Alaska during the war years. However, the war ended before it was ever of any use. The YT Husky, which is the most powerful boat in the north. It is interesting that all the northern tugs have at least 4 and sometimes 6 rudders, which are essential to give them added steering power in the swift water, and all the numerous turns in the river, which they must negotiate with caution. More than one valuable load of cargo has been lost on the river, and in Great Slave Lake, particularly during the war years. Bulldozers and other equipment are still being salvaged from the depths. Seagulls here are no different to those throughout the rest of the world. They will eat anything, and were delighted with the scraps thrown to them by Bobby and Claire. The YT Husky with the ever-present clotheslines and washing hanging out to dry, which characterizes all river traffic on the Mackenzie. As the navigation season is only some 90 days, everything operates round the clock with thousands of tons of freight moving in both directions. The Franklin Mountains in the distance, and some of the crew taking a little nap. A typical Mackenzie River tow, which is not actually a tow, as the tugs push 3 or 4 barges ahead of them. The reason being to better navigate the swift rapids on the river, which do not toss and boil as we know them in the east. They swirl at a great depth, sometimes as high as 12 knots. Mackenzie described them as seething with a noise like a kettle. Needless to say, one of the more popular hours during the day was the one between 6 and 7 p.m. You can just make out our little boat, which is dwarfed by the scenery which surrounded us. Here is one of the most stirring sections of the river, the Ramparts, where the Indians say the river becomes tired and turns over on its side to rest. This is a section of about 7 miles, where it narrows down and flows at a depth of 200 feet, with sheer limestone cliffs rising to heights of 300 feet on either side. During this time of the year, the herring enter the mouth of the river some 500 miles away and come up here to spawn. The Indians set up fishing camps along the beach and net them by the thousands. Here, perhaps more than any other part of the river, there seemed to be a feeling of being far away from everything, of experiencing a voyage into the past, which in reality is descriptive of the entire river. We stopped for a while at one of the camps and found these people to be friendly, particularly one chap, Joshua Manuel, who described to us many aspects of how the Indians live in this part of the country. The stench of dead and drying fish was rather difficult to become accustomed to. All of us, however, spent a good deal of time looking and wandering through the camp at our leisure, at times amazed by what we saw, but always being careful not to show too much emotion one way or another. the usual dogs, and because they are chained on the beach, they dig holes to escape from the hot sun. This is how they spend the entire summer. As we approached the camp, we were later told that this old man, not speaking English, said to his friends, "White man, bad medicine, tell nothing but lies." A typical smokehouse, after which the fish are hung out to dry in the sun. This little Indian girl, Celine, was transfixed by her own portrait which Lauren had done. She was not alone, as the whole camp were utterly amazed. Our next stop was Fort Good Hope. Incidentally, last winter they had an average temperature of 40 degrees below zero. We visited the Catholic Church, the interior of which had been decorated by Indian artists. We were warmly received by the two sisters whom we were to later meet again at Inuvik. After leaving Fort Good Hope, we stopped at a delightful little river called Hare Indian, where I ventured into the water and found it no colder than the lower St. Lawrence, which isn't exactly warm. The next morning, after a short run, we discovered an oil barge tied up along the beach, which had been left for us during the night by one of the Illinois transportation tugs. Our tanks were almost empty, and it took most of the morning before we were able to fill them, a task performed with a small hand pump. There seems to be an unwritten law in the North that everyone automatically helps everyone else. We were to see evidence of this many times during our voyage. Lauren, by this time, had sketched from every position on the boat and was rapidly using up his supplies. During the afternoon following our refueling, we nosed into Travaillon River, and here I might say that I lost one of the largest fish I have ever seen. Unfortunately, no one recorded the struggle with my movie camera, so you will just have to take my word for it. Our artist did more sketching here, and I rowed out in the dinghy and took a shot of the Liard River emerging from the trees. We then had our first rainstorm. Even the rainbows in this country are tremendous, and who knows, there just could be a pot of gold at the end of this one. Our next stop was Arctic Red River, a trapping settlement well above the Arctic Circle, and which marks the start of where the river begins to enter its enormous delta. Here again were the ever-present dogs of varying color. The local church and vegetable garden maintained by the sisters. After leaving Arctic Red River, we stopped on a steep incline on the beach, while Claire and Lucille were able to gather some fresh water, which was flowing out of the rocks and which had a rather metallic taste. Here begins the true delta with its low-lying land, which is constantly being eroded by the river. From this point down to the ocean, there exists some of the finest fur-producing areas in the world, most of it being muskrat and mink, but also wolverine, marten, lynx, and beaver. Bobby displayed an ingenious method to cope with the daily washing problem. The artist does his share, too. We stopped for the night in the channel on the way to Inuvik. It was a beautiful evening, and Lorne painted until well after midnight. These pictures of the sun setting were taken about 11 p.m. Clara trying her luck, but the fish were not being very cooperative. In the morning, the YT Marjorie rushed past us on her way up the river. We finally arrived at the town of Inuvik, which was completely built by the government about 9 years ago. The first thing that struck us was the heating, which is entirely overground, as the permafrost prevents any excavation. All of us were intrigued with our visit to the igloo-shaped church. We again met our friends from Fort Good Hope, including Father Adam, who was somewhat of a legend in the North Country. Inuvik maintains a tremendous school and mission for Indian and Eskimo children. We were very kindly shown throughout the various buildings by the sisters. We thanked Father Adam for our interesting tour of his church and returned to the Liard River. The harbor at Inuvik was a busy place, and we met the crew of the little YT Scamp, a Yellowknife vessel. We refueled and also had to purchase fresh water, there being no other method of acquiring it. Also in the harbor was a mission boat which visits the various outlying posts. Located about 50 miles north of Inuvik is Reindeer Depot, where every fall the 6,000-odd reindeer in controlled herds are rounded up and counted. About 600 or 700 are shot to provide food for the winter. The skins also serve many useful purposes. Just as we arrived, the little plane departing, we later learned, was flying to some Arctic island to pick up an Eskimo who was in need of an emergency operation. A happy Indian boy obliges for the camera. His younger brother, however, is somewhat shy. The true Mackenzie River Delta, which was one of the most enormous in the Western Hemisphere, a fantastic maze of islands and channels surrounded by Arctic tundra, at the end of which is the Arctic Ocean. Perhaps here, on this very location, was experienced for the first time the true meaning of how silence can be deafening and the immensity of the land in which we were. Within a very few miles of the river, when its warming influence ceases, the temperature difference can be as much as 30 degrees. The only vegetation that exists here is this green moss, which is a true indication of tundra. On our way to Tuk-Tuk, we came upon the YT Scamp hard aground with her barge. Apparently, she had attempted to navigate in the fog during the night and had gone well out of the channel. Her captain was running the engines and churning up the bottom of the river in an attempt to dig a channel through which he hoped to refloat the barge. As we were to discover later, he was successful. Bobby explaining the merits of an unnamed product, and also his mustache, of which he was very proud. The Arctic Ocean at last. Due north over this expanse of water is the North Pole. We arrived at Tuktoyaktuk at sundown. The harbor looked desolate and empty, except for an RCMP vessel and other small fishing craft. On the banks is one of the 99-odd Jew-line radar stations which span the north from Alaska to Greenland. Some Eskimo boys who had to be persuaded to have their pictures taken. There remain very few Eskimos in the Western Arctic who are purebred. Over the years, they have interbred with Asiatics and even Fiji Islanders, who have been members of whaling expeditions in the north. Some of the older men showing a little curious interest. The next morning, we departed for the 150-mile voyage back to Inuvik and the airport. We were delighted to find our friends from the mission waiting to greet a newcomer. The rather small and well-fed one is Sistery Bear, who is an ardent hockey fan and actually the manager and coach of the Indian and Eskimo boys at the mission. As we were about to board our plane, Father Adam proudly collected a husky puck for a friend. With the sun setting over the Arctic, we left this great land with the hope that someday we would return again.